Okay, so hello and welcome to David McNulty, the director of A Film on Film, and to Selina Mayer, the artist and photographer who the film's about. Thank you both for joining this Q&A, and I'm so pleased that you could both join because watching the film, the kind of real intimacy of it makes it feel like it must have been quite a collaborative project between you two. So I wanted to start by asking whether you were already collaborators or whether you came to this partnership fresh to make this film. What's the relationship and how did this film come about?
Selina, do you want to start?
Well, the very, very initial trigger for the project was because we were living together in a big old warehouse in Manor House, and we got into a conversation about film stock, and Don found out that you can get my preferred film stock that I use for all my photos on Super 8. He'd also recently acquired a couple of Super 8 cameras, and that was just the initial spark. But we were already friends, and we were already having long, rambling conversations about art and film. So this was the first thing I think we did together, but we'd been talking about collaborating for a while. Yeah.
It feels like it's really sort of beautifully double-coded as we hear you speak, Selina, and the way that you're talking about your work on film is obviously talking about shooting moving images on film as well. So there's kind of so much to process there. David, or who Selina's also referring to as Don, how much do you normally shoot on film? Were you choosing your stock in order to sort of on a project basis to work for this, or is that your preferred kind of medium anyway?
So for this project, actually, this was the first time I'd shot on the particular film stock. I'd shot Super 8 before, but always in colour and sort of used Vision 3 stock, which is the same film stock that a lot of 35mm films are shot on, sort of big Hollywood films. They use Vision 3 as a standard stock. It's a workhorse, and they also do it in the Super 8 format. So I'd experimented with that up to the point of talking to Selina, and I was doing a little research mission, like I'd like to do a project, maybe explore a different film stock. And then when the Tri-X kind of conversation we struck on, I think maybe I sort of went down a research mission and found that they'd got Tri-X Super 8 stock, and then that was it. We decided then to go for it. I was really fascinated what it might look like shooting, the process of shooting on Tri-X, and it's just that was the beginning, really. That was the sort of spark.
And had you seen Selina on a shoot before? Did you kind of know what? It seems like a very kind of peaceful and very natural experience. Did you know that's the kind of vibe that you were going to be filming?
So I had an idea that it would be like that. I think that I had Selina, did I lend you a light bulb for the Chiaroscuro series? And then then you told me about that, and that was a studio-based shoot. And then I think you had a desire to work outside.
It was, and it was actually very early on in me working with people who weren't my friends, people who were near strangers. So I had met Rory, who's the model in the film, a month before on my second ever shoot with a model, and that was the one that I borrowed the light bulb from you for. And then she's American and she travels for work constantly. She's been doing it for 8-9 years now. And she was in Europe for a couple of months, and she came through London twice. And the second time around, she was the one who insisted that we do a shoot outside. I'd never done a nude shoot outside before, which is hard to believe if you are familiar with my work now, because it's 90% nude work outside. But that was the very, very beginning one. Because she really wanted to do something that was very different to what we'd done before, because the shoots were so close together. So it is very like what my shoots are like, but it was the very earliest stages of that happening.
And what was it about shooting outside that has meant that since that point you are mostly shooting outside?
Well, I've always been, I kind of take comfort from being in nature, and when I started discovering various women artists and photographers who do this incredible work re-engaging with nature, I just got so inspired by it, but I was always too afraid to do it myself. I remember trying to do some self-portraits outside a couple of years before, and just was so filled with anxiety that I could barely take any. So this was me finally kind of taking the plunge. But I'd seen things like, there's a photographer called Anne Brigman who used to do nude self-portraits outside in nature. And there's a photograph in particular that I think has been hugely influential, which is called The Soul of the Blasted Pine, where she's placed herself inside the stump of a tree that's been struck by lightning, and her form is kind of following the shape of how the tree used to be. And that kind of imagery, instead of just being a figure plonked into nature, I place figures within it. So that location as well, we chose because it has all this ivy everywhere. And so it was one of the few places in November where we could reliably, I wouldn't have asked anyone to do an outdoor nude shoot in November. It was only because it was her suggestion. But yeah, we chose that location because it was one of the few places that would have this greenery, this rich greenery that you could be enveloped in at that time of year. But I was up in Epping Forest only yesterday, rolling around in ferns and things, and getting really scratched up. But yeah, that's been a big part of my work ever since, really.
And it looks like I noticed in the credits that the actual location for the shoot was at Abney Park Cemetery in Stoke Newington in London.
Yes, yeah.
Which is such an interesting space anyway, being this really, really old, quite overgrown space, but in a really built up.
And some fascinating trees in it, because I think for a time it was a Victorian botanical gardens, although it was a burial ground before that, and then I think the Victorians overplanted it. So you could go for a walk there in summer, and there are some fantastic exotic trees that you wouldn't expect to find there. I mean, Selina knows this place a lot better than I do, but whenever I go there, I'm always amazed by the selections of wildlife that they have.
The location seemed to really feed into, for me, a lot of what you were talking about in your voiceover, Selina, about slowing down time, and about kind of choosing your frames more specifically because of the restrictions of analog photography. I just wondered, maybe David, if you could talk a little bit about some of the other themes that you were bringing into the film.
Well, yeah, okay. I think there was, in terms of the mechanics of making the film, there's a big mirror in terms of, Selina says in the voiceover, there's only 10 frames and a roll of film. I could only afford, I think, 5 rolls of Super 8 in terms of the developing and the scanning. That was the maximum of the budget as a sort of self-funded film. So immediately there's a workflow mirror that one of the things that definitely I sort of had on my little list of things that, going into the shoot, was to create a body of rushes that felt in the scene and intimately part of the scene, and to shoot like a small selection that would be outside of the scene, sort of down a longer lens. And I just rewatched the film this morning, and I was really reminded by the amount. I was really reminded by the amount of the longer lens stuff that didn't make it in because obviously the final cut's sort of 6 minutes. And there's just sort of one short in the sort of the towards the end of the film, there's a sort of a section where it gets faster cut, and you're sort of looking through the bushes, and then through Selina's arm, and then sort of, and then every time Selina with that huge medium format camera, it's sort of making the shutter, and then the action, that how our bodies start to reflect so there was Rory's body reflecting the environment that she was in, and then Selina's body reflecting the mechanics of the camera, and then I was sort of further back, reflecting that myself. And I think it was around that point that there was a sort of dog walker or someone, a park walker, ran past, and it was sort of duck down in sort of, pretend we're not here. And I think I remember at that moment, I suddenly felt that being further back, looking down the long lens, was almost, it was the sort of the voyeuristic, if that person had stopped to sort of gaze and peer into the bushes, that was sort of their view into the scene. And then obviously making a sort of documentary of this nature, documentation, I just sort of wanted to present some options that then in the edit, it would be interesting to play with these two views, the sort of inside view and the outsider's view, and find something between the two.
And somehow that idea of the longer, slightly questioning whether it's a voyeuristic lens and the closer, very intimate lens also leads into this sort of second link between, well, you touch on it a bit in the film and also in your description of the film about our kind of easy access to nude images in the digital age, and whether I guess the kind of analog photography, the very physical nature of being with somebody to take art images of nudes that's been done for thousands of years. Does that analog photography kind of separate you, take you further away from this throwaway culture of kind of sexualized nudes online? Now, it might be a complicated way of asking a basic question. For either of you.
That's an interesting one, because it's actually, I have this weirdly polarized relationship with the internet and the presentation of the nude form online, because the majority of people I've worked with, I meet through the internet. I found Rory through Tumblr. I found, and then eventually it became through word of mouth, through various people that I've worked with. So I have a lot to be thankful for the internet. However, I'm also raging on a regular basis because of recent legislation. A couple of years ago, the US brought in something known as FOSTA-SESTA, which is the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which is on the surface supposed to be a good thing to fight online sex trafficking, but what ended up happening was they made these very vague guidelines and then told websites and providers that they were now responsible for the content posted by third parties. So Facebook can be sued if someone ends up getting trafficked through them, things like that. So what happened is all these companies responded with bringing down these incredibly restrictive censorship regulations. So Tumblr, where I'd had a blog for years, just banned nudity entirely. Patreon, where I make a lot of my money, Patreon pays for my studio. I wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise, but they have banned showing any nudity, even implied nudity, publicly. So I've essentially been forced into having a pay site, even though I don't want one, because they won't let me. And I think they have to be more restrictive because people make money on that site. Instagram is a whole other just infuriating bundle of censorship. So what happens is that the only nude bodies that people have access to it's a very specific kind, usually in mainstream pornography. More and more independent pornography is becoming priced out of the market, or they just can't find anywhere that will allow them to show their work. Artists, painters, and people who illustrate can still get away with sharing nude imagery, but if you take photographs,
right,
it's getting harder and harder to ever show your work, which is infuriating. Even Twitter censors my own posts. It puts a little thing on top saying, this is sensitive content that you may not want to see. So it's a very different, it's a significantly different world now than it was at the time when we first shot the film, which was 2013. And then when we recorded the audio, which was, I think, about 18 months afterwards, because this has all happened in the last 3-4 years. So yeah, essentially my point I'm trying to get to after all the rambling is that we're only exposed to very specific kinds of bodies now, and it's the bodies that are chosen to be shown by those who have enough money to host their own content rather than having to rely on other providers. So at least by having everything on analog, I'm not going to end up with my hard drive getting wiped or anything like that. I have the master copies of everything. It does seem incredibly counterproductive when I shoot things on film, scan them into a computer, censor them, and then post them on Instagram. Yeah.
It's so interesting to have made this film and then to be able to reflect on it at this future time, with things moving on the internet in the way that they are. I think we're almost out of time, but before we wrap up, I'm just so interested in the fact that you shot the film and then recorded the voiceover, the words that you're saying 18 months later. Is that just a time thing? What did that kind of lag between the filming and the recording add to the final film?
It definitely added some time for reflection, I think, because by the time we finally well, actually, I shot the film and got it developed, kind of ran out of money, and moving house and things, and so I had these sort of 5 reels of film sitting in front of me, and I would on my desk, I'm not going to tidy them away. They just got to sit there and until the time's right that I can get into an edit. And to kickstart the editing process, I went for a recorded audio chat with Selina one evening with a bottle of wine, and the time that had passed definitely allowed, from my point of view, making the film, allowed some separation from the act of shooting to the act of editing, and sort of definitely, I'm a romantic when it comes to Super 8 and analog photography and film, so the act of turning over a camera for 5 rolls of film, those rolls of film, every frame is sacred. But in order to sort of think, actually, right, what is this film going to be about? Well, it needs to come from the conversation and then allow that to sort of guide the visual cut. Having that time pass allowed enough separation to be able to really reflect, and to be able to take our conversation down sort of avenues that I probably wouldn't have thought about at the beginning of the process, because the original spark was, let's make a film on film. And actually, I think what was in the rushes was a lot more than something that had sparked from a sort of technical or format obsession, say.
Well, that idea of the kind of benefit of having that length of time and that reflection seems really fitting. It seems like that.
If I remember right as well, David brought the rushes along to our conversation, which I hadn't actually seen at that point.
Yes.
So just before we started recording our conversation, he actually showed me the rushes. So I saw the footage for the first time in, well, I'd obviously never seen it before. And when you're taking photos and someone is behind you filming, you're not paying attention to where they are. So I had no idea what it would end up looking like. But because we had that length of time, like Don said, there was time to reflect on it and have a distance from the living experience to look at it a bit more objectively, but in a bit more depth as well. And also after that, in that gap, I'd gone on a road trip with Rory. I spent 6 weeks traveling across the US with her. We started in Boston and finished in San Francisco. So my perspective on her and from working with a nude model had changed significantly in that time as well. And I feel like I was a bit more well informed in the scenes that came up in our conversations. And I felt like I was able to be a lot more coherent at that point than I would have been at the time.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, it's a really just a beautiful, reflective and thoughtful film, which I really enjoyed. So thank you to both of you. And thank you so much for this really great conversation about it and being so open and talking about your process. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you.